Last November, Guyana went into an elections period and for the first time in 60 years produced parliamentary results which cannot function on the basis of ethnic loyalties alone. As Guyanese people, we need to get race out of our politics or else we'll keep repeating the same thing every 5 years when there's an election. During elections, an organization, Rights of Children Rock, that I'm a part of, began to ask ourselves, since when did Guyanese politics become so intertwined with race? So we took a trip to the archives to do some research and we produced a short documentary on, it's called The Story of Politics, and it was produced with the aim of educating young people about Guyana's history, since it's hardly ever taught and there are hardly any books for us to find out about it. So let's take a look at the short video we produced.
Once upon a time, there was a magic country. Thousands of African slaves were brought to Guyana, followed by waves of indentured laborers from China, Portugal, the Middle East, and most of all from India. Despite having different occupations, the Creole laborer and East Indian estate worker both suffered from poor wages, little access to land, racial prejudice, a cruel magistracy, and repressive militia. However, divide and rule policies prevented the different ethnic groups from realizing these shared hardships. The right to vote was gradually extended to all the population. This enabled the different races to unite in 1953 to win elections. Almost immediately, the colonial power prevented them from ruling, which led to tensions and the eventual division of the united movement along racial lines into the PPP, with strong support from the East Indian rural communities and the Afro-urban based PNC. Manipulation of ethnic fears led to years of economic sabotage, racial violence and killings. Burning of houses and migration, particularly of Portuguese and Chinese. Political independence brought hope of a new era of cooperation among people in a new society, reflecting our motto, one people, one nation, one destiny, and slogans such as feed, clothe, and house the nation. Regrettably, these ideals were taken to extremes, which included militarizing the society, prohibiting importation of foodstuffs, widespread controls of all aspects of life, which aggravated ethnic divisions and were sustained by fraudulent elections. In the early 1990s, civic effort produced free and fair elections, economic growth, hope of remigration, investment, expansion of television, communications, better education, and housing. Within a few years, the failure to get rid of the repressive constitution forced on the people in the 1980s led to disillusion. The benefits of the new economy were not shared equally by different ethnic groups. The intertwining of politics and illegal commerce produced a drug culture and widespread corruption. This in turn fueled violence and massacres. Guyanese of all ethnic groups, except a wealthy elite, were left fearful and disheartened. Guyana is at a crossroads. We can continue down the path of division, migration, high suicide rates and low levels of living, or we can pull together to create a more inclusive future This means
I think that we should hopefully try to be optimistic, and I think that optimism must come from people taking action and doing something about, bringing about change.
I think people are concerned about their own livelihoods. Human beings are always concerned about their own livelihoods and how they see the rest of Guyana. It just depends on what, will they be able to survive here.
I would like to see a government that will be a government for all the people, despite who voted for you.
Political system or structure that is, I suppose, takes into consideration really uniting Guyanese rather than dividing, and really having that as a mandate for going forward.
I would like to see our country as our motto: one people, one nation, one destiny, and I'm not seeing that.
I think the immediate future is very dark, but I think the distant future, particularly because of the young people, is very bright. But I think there's a lot that we have to get past before we get to that bright future. But I have a lot of faith in the youth.
who wins the next elections is less important than all political parties pledging to bring an end to manipulating ethnic groups for political ends. We cannot move forward until we set aside the past and create a modern society in which all citizens feel secure to live and build their future.
Okay, I hope you found that video very educational and informative, and please take note that it summarizes 50 years of Guyana's history into 5 minutes. But it is enough for you to seriously start thinking about the way race has been used to manipulate Guyanese people and sustain racial tensions over the years for political advantages. We took a trip to the East Coast to speak with a few older persons about what happened in the 1960s. What incidents can they remember? First off, I spoke with Mrs. Herod, who resides in Clonbrook. So, Ms. Harold, I think you said you lived on the East Coast almost all your life.
Yes.
Is there anything striking, any periods during that time of incidents you could remember?
A guy had been murdered, and there were some Indians in front of where I was living, and they started to threaten me.
Mm-hmm.
I had to walk out the house after the guy said he's going home for his cutlass, and he would start killing from left, right, and center. I walked out, and I went to waterside at my mother-in-law, which in his new neighboring area, and I slept there that night. I left my house door open with everything inside. I used to live at some East Indian place, and they watch over the house for the night. On the 21st of January, my baby was just about around 7 to 8 days old, and I had to flee my home again because there was a fire at a masjid.
When you left the Indian village Cranbrook to go to the African village, was it like a scenario where Indians were also leaving that village to go to an Indian place?
Some Indian people move out from the area too, and go to other villages and live, because after the tension, a lot of people move.
What about your Indian friends? Like when you left Clonbrook, did you still keep in contact with them?
Up to now.
Up to now? You're
Yes.
still friends?
Yes, we're still friends.
Was it just something that was happening on the East Coast, or would you say it was happening all over Guyana?
That was all over.
All over?
It was all over.
Okay, what really fueled all of this violence? Was it an election year or election period or something?
It wasn't an election period. I feel in the 60s, there was a political interference.
After speaking with Mrs. Herod, an old friend stopped by, Mr. Sertiman, who also had some memories to share.
We had a lot of vacant houses or vacant lots because of fire. The black used to burn down the Indians them in the black area because we don't want them, so to speak. I was a transport worker with the railway train, and you can imagine Indian meat box in the area they got a dock. That was the introduction of the big race war in this country. That box in a place. And the two people name was husband and wife, CD. They bring them in a boat, get people, and then they start to burn down all them places and books and the Indian shop. The politics grew to an extent where it becomes one of the, I must say, the main, the main way forward for the politicians to make inroad or to gain prominence with the politics.
In addition to visiting Mrs. Herod and Mr. Sertiman, I was also able to speak with someone who had some childhood memories of living on the East Coast. With us today I have Miss Mendonza, who also grew up on the East Coast. So Miss Mendonza, living on the East Coast in the 1960s, what stories or incidents could you remember in terms of racial tensions?
Well, in the 1960s, actually it was more around 1963-64. That as a child, a young woman growing up, I recall some of those incidents. Of course, prior to that, you know, one wasn't aware of racial tension among family or friends or neighbors in our community. But that period of 63-64, there were a few incidents. The one that I found most upsetting was having the lack of sleep at night. Yes, that fear of going to bed and knowing that all the siblings, mainly brothers, my family, I have 7 brothers and sisters, and the older ones had to sort of, quote unquote, keep watch at night. In those days, of course, you can see the houses on the parallel street, you know, across, and there was one shop there with a family, and I actually saw a baby being thrown out of that shop window, and to this day, you know, that memory is with me, you know, a young baby, you know.
What would you say fueled these tensions? How did it all start?
I would think that the tensions were more imported to the village. You know, it was the politics, the racial riots that began, I think, more in Georgetown or around Georgetown. The strikes that began, and certainly the violence I learned afterwards, and even then as a young child, because even as a child too, we were encouraged to ask some questions in my family, and I'm lucky that I not only had a father, but even neighbors next door, Mr. Kelman. I used to ask him quite a number of questions, you know, why? And they would say, well, you know, well, this violence is being done mainly by people outside of the village.
In terms of migration, did a lot of persons leave during that time?
Not a lot, but a few families did leave.
As in?
Like, for example, the families, like say the Ramkeller ones behind us, you know. Our family, the Kelmans, the Accras, and other families made sure that they were safe and sound, you know, so they didn't have to leave. But there was a family a couple doors away who went over to Better Hope in the other community, the nearby community, and they actually swapped homes with an Afro community, the Afro family, the Hardys.
Okay, so your family didn't actually leave the village?
No. Neither do I think the other Portuguese or Chinese families, like the Chocotais. We didn't feel, perhaps, no, I can't say we didn't feel as threatened, but it's, you know, the security of where do you move to, you know, where do you move to.
Thank you guys for staying tuned to today's program, and that's all for this segment. It's important to remember that we should not rush into blaming people for what happened, but we should research the facts. Our concern at FTF was to find out from some people what really happened in the 1960s, and then we'd be in a better position to work out how we could get race out of our politics.